Can the Denver Broncos build on what we saw them do against the Chicago Bears, especially in the second half in the Nathaniel Hackett Bowl here on Sunday against the New York Jets? We're going to find out, and we're going to talk about this matchup on a special crossover Thursday episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome to a Locked On crossover Thursday here. Sayre Bedinger, co-host of the Locked On Broncos podcast, right alongside John Butchko, host of the Locked On Jets podcast. And we are here to break down one of the most anticipated games for both the Denver Broncos and the New York Jets, at least before the season. All the comments from Sean Payton about former Denver Broncos head coach and current New York Jets offensive coordinator Nathaniel Hackett. And we're going to break down all the biggest stories, the key matchups. But I want to tell you, today's crossover Thursday episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use the code all lowercase LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. John, I feel like every time I've talked to you before in the past, we were talking about Brett Rippon playing against the New York Jets, but now we finally get Russell Wilson, or the Broncos starting quarterback, against the New York Jets. And I know obviously it's kind of tough on the other end. It's not the anticipated matchup, but from your side of things this week leading up to this game, what are the biggest storylines, or maybe what's the biggest story for the New York Jets going into Denver to play the Broncos?
The Jets are 1-3 right now, but there is a bit of renewed hope around this team based on the way they played against the Kansas City Chiefs on Sunday night. I said heading into that game that I felt like it was a make or break game for the New York Jets. I felt like they could not fall to 1-3. And look, it's going to be a tough hole to climb out of right now. But the way that they played, I think, does at least give you some degree of hope. And it's not necessarily that they played the Chiefs close because, like half the games in the NFL are one-score games. You see bad teams play good teams tight every week. It's that the offense finally felt like it started to click, especially with Zach Wilson. It felt like the Jets found some concepts he was comfortable running. With Zach Wilson, it's been rough. His 2+ seasons have not gone well. And heading into this game against Kansas City, there were a lot of calls for the Jets to bench him. And they don't really have an option right now. They just signed former Bronco, actually a guy who's spent a brief stint with the Jets, Trevor Siemian. But Siemian's, I'm not sure he's up to speed on the playbook yet. I'm not sure he's going to be active on Sunday. They signed him to the practice squad to kind of work him into the system. That said, Zach Wilson was facing a lot. It's not, like I said, he struggled the first couple of weeks of the season. Now, he played well enough week 1 for the Jets to win. I think week 2, he showed some positive signs, but the Jets only scored 10 points. Week 3 was a disaster for him. He looked completely overwhelmed by what Bill Belichick threw at him, and there was not a lot of optimism heading into the game against the Chiefs. He delivered. It was probably his best game in the NFL. He looked comfortable in the pocket. He was making decisive reads. But as you know, in the NFL, storylines can change from week to week. Heading into last week's game, the storyline was Zach Wilson's really struggling. Now there's a little bit of momentum behind him, but one of the stories of Zach Wilson's career has always been whenever he's taken a step forward, it's been followed by taking 2 steps back. And for the Jets right now, this is definitely a must-win game. And no disrespect to the Broncos, but if you look at their upcoming schedule, they have Philadelphia coming up right after this. If they lose this game, very easy to envision a 1-5 start to the season. And I don't care who you are. You're just not going to come back from that. Jets win this game. They get to 2-3. We'll see what happens against Philadelphia. The schedule should soften up a little bit in the weeks ahead. So this game, I feel like, is kind of a turning point for the New York Jets. It's a turning point for Zach Wilson. Can he stack a second good game on top of what he did against the Chiefs last week? And can the Jets avoid a 1-4 start? Because I think if they lose this game, there's no coming back. And it's interesting because in many ways, the game these teams played last year in Denver was a turning point for the Jets. They won that game. It was actually their 4th straight win. They were on a winning streak, but they lost Breece Hall and they lost Elijah Vera Tucker in that game. And those ended up being key players that they missed down the stretch where they kind of collapsed.
Right. It does feel like must win, kind of on both sides, but I suppose that's the hole that you dig yourself in when you're 1-3 to start the season, regardless of whether it's due to injuries or whether it's due to whatever. But I'm completely with you on that. It feels like must win from both sides. Just to, like you said, the Jets play the Eagles coming up. The Broncos play the Chiefs next week on Thursday, so they have a short turnaround. So you want to make sure you get this win. I think that really identifies what you just said there, this being a must-win game, kind of indicator of what the Broncos' biggest storyline is that, hey, we wondered after the debacle against the Miami Dolphins, allowing 70 points, what heads were going to roll defensively. It took a little bit, but we started to see that. Now, the biggest storyline for the Broncos going into the Jets week is now Randy Gregory, the team's biggest money free agent acquisition in 2022, has now been just flat out cut. And that was probably the biggest, I think, head to roll from that debacle against the Dolphins. Is now you've cut a starting defensive player, a guy who was expected to be your number one pass rusher. You take a $16.1 million dead cap hit for this season, and you go with the youth movement. And not only was Randy Gregory let go, but the Broncos then also went in and they waived starting slot corner Isang Bassi. And hopefully that's a sign that they're feeling like K'Wan Williams is ready to come back and healthy and come off injured reserve. But the biggest storyline for Denver is really, like you mentioned with Zach Wilson, can they build off of what they showed in the second half against the Chicago Bears? Because they were down 28-7, they scored 24 unanswered points, come back to get your first win of the season. You're now feeling good. Your defense came up with some big stops after we didn't see them stop much of anything from the beginning of the Dolphins game, or really the second half of the Commanders game the week before, all the way into the end of the first half against Chicago. So pretty much 2 full games of just complete defensive incompetence, followed by maybe some signs of life there in the second half against Chicago. So that's probably the biggest storyline from Denver's perspective going into this game. Although I know Broncos fans there's a cult following for old Trevor Siemian. They're the last quarterback to provide the team with a winning record in a season all the way back in 2016. So I know Broncos, John, I tell you right now, there's many number 13 jerseys that still go to training camp. They go to games. People love Trevor Siemian. So I'm sure he'll get a warm homecoming. But obviously, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention maybe the biggest storyline in this game, which is Nathaniel Hackett returning to Denver.
Yeah, and I don't know whether it was as big of a story in Denver as it was in New York in the preseason, but of course, the new Broncos coach, Sean Payton, was very critical of the job Nathaniel Hackett did in Denver a year ago, and I'm not sure it was unjust. I mean, I thought from afar, it seemed like Hackett was pretty bad with Denver. Aaron Rodgers is very close with Nathaniel Hackett, and at the time he kind of mentioned that he was circling this game on his calendar. And of course, Rodgers is not going to be there. I'll tell you, the first 3 weeks of the season, I think there were a lot of people in New York who agreed with Sean Payton, because Hackett's game plans were not good in these games. They were not creative. They were not doing a lot to challenge a defense. I thought Hackett was much better against Kansas City. I mean, I'll give you the numbers. In week 3 against New England, the first 3 quarters of the game where the Jets could not generate any offense, they ran the ball 10 out of 13 times on first down. And then they finally started opening up the offense on first down in the final quarter. That's when the Jets put together their best drive of the game. You found much more balance against the Chiefs. I think that's part of the reason Zach Wilson had more success, because the Jets kept putting Zach Wilson in bad downs and distances against New England. Whereas against Kansas City, they caught them a little bit by surprise because the Chiefs were expecting them to run on first down, but they gave him some easier throws to make. So I think a big question, which Nathaniel Hackett's going to show up, and I'm sure he's got this game circled on his calendar since he took the job with the Jets.
Right. And we're going to talk about those individual matchups within this game, meaning Nathaniel Hackett going up against Vance Joseph's defense. Vance Joseph also not the most favored coach in, Broncos country at this point, but certainly Sean Payton against Robert Saleh and that Jets defense. That's going to be 2 masterminds of their craft as well. And we're going to break down those matchups and more coming up here on this crossover Thursday edition, Locked On Jets, Locked On Broncos.
Today's crossover episode between Locked On Broncos and Locked On Jets is brought to you by our friends over there at PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the most fun that I've had, winning up to 25 times my money this football season. You just select 2 or more players. You pick more or less on their projected stats, and then you place your entry. PrizePicks is really simple to play. I can make my picks and submit my entry in less than 60 seconds. They have quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of players and stat types are what make PrizePicks the #1 daily fantasy sports app. With the PrizePicks reboot policy, your entries stay in place even if one of your players gets injured. For NFL games and college football top 25 matchups, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player is rebooted. PrizePicks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with injury insurance. So check it out today. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100.
And before we get into our key matchups for this game, and individually so, we want to give a huge shout out and say thank you to all of you that make Locked On Broncos and Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every single day. We're super grateful for every single one of you listening to the podcast wherever free and available that you can find podcasts, as well as on YouTube where you can watch the show. And John, I'm excited to break down these individual matchups between these two teams, but I want to throw it to you. Is there anything that stands out in particular as a matchup that you have circled beyond the Jets versus Broncos? Okay, now we got the comments from Sean Payton to Nathaniel Hackett, but the games within the game, right? That's what we're looking at here. What's the matchup maybe that you're looking forward to the most?
One I have my eye on is Garrett Wilson versus Pat Surtain, who's, that's a premier matchup. And last year, Surtain, I thought, had the better of Garrett Wilson. And it was at a weird point for the Jets because, as I mentioned earlier, Breece Hall was still playing really well. The offense had kind of been built around Hall. He had a long touchdown run in that game, and then he suffered a knee injury, which knocked him out the rest of the season. So Garrett Wilson had a weird 2022, his rookie season, where he got off to a great start. Week 2, he had over 100 yards. He had 2 touchdowns against Cleveland. Then he kind of became an afterthought for a stretch. And part of that stretch was Denver. I think part of it was that, he just lost the battle to Surtain. It's different this year. Garrett Wilson is the go-to, even with Breece Hall back and even with Breece Hall playing really well. Garrett Wilson is the go-to guy on this offense. This is the guy the offense is built around. He's getting around a 33% target share, which is very high. And we talked about Zach Wilson a little bit earlier. Zach Wilson is looking to Garrett Wilson before he looks to anybody else, which is right. Garrett Wilson ended up putting 1,100 yards up last year. He was the offensive rookie of the year. So this offense needs Garrett Wilson to produce. They need Garrett Wilson to have a big day. And Zach Wilson needs Garrett Wilson to be open. I think that it's going to be important for Garrett Wilson to have a better day than he did against Denver last year. Last year, the Jets were kind of able to ride that Breece Hall run and their defense because they were going up against Brett Rippon. It's not the same this year. I think Garrett Wilson's got to produce for the Jets this year in this game.
Yeah, and I think from the Broncos side of things, another Jets offensive matchup against Broncos defensive matchup will be Breece Hall, as you mentioned, going up against a Denver Broncos run defense that has given up over 500 rushing yards in the last 2 weeks, which I wish was sarcasm. I wish was an exaggeration, but it's reality. It's the reality that we're living in. The Broncos run defense has been atrocious the last couple games. Even if you want to go back to all the way to week 1, I don't think it's just been the last couple games. The Raiders really played great ball control against Denver. They were able to convert short yardage situations consistently, winning the line of scrimmage. The Washington Commanders down 21-3 against the Broncos at one point, able to utilize Brian Robinson Jr. and get back into the game with the running game somehow. We've seen the last couple of weeks, the Dolphins, the A-chain over there in Miami, as well as this past weekend against Chicago with, Khalil Herbert and Roschon Johnson. Everybody has been running on the Denver defense. And so what is going to be different against the New York Jets, where you've got Breece Hall, you got Dalvin Cook, you got Michael Carter, Zach Wilson proved against Denver last year that he can win running the ball as well if your initial pass rush doesn't get home. So are the Broncos going to be effective enough against the run to be able to kind of put the ball? And I think from the Broncos perspective, you want to put the ball in Zach Wilson's hands as much as possible to get him dropping back and having to throw as much as possible. But can you stop the run? I mean, it's giving up big gains on first down. And then that's where the Jets and other teams be able to open up the playbook against this Denver defense. So that's an area right now. The Broncos run defense against anybody the Jets put back there in the backfield. Doesn't seem to matter who it is, or if you get, receivers coming across the formation, can the Denver Broncos stop the bleeding in their run defense? That's going to be a huge matchup within this game.
And I think in many ways, this was a joke that I heard prior to the game between the Jets and the Chiefs. The Jets offense played well in that game, so maybe it doesn't apply anymore. But heading into last weekend, it felt like this was the game between the stoppable force and the movable object. Who would come out in front there. The thing that's interesting about the Jets' run offense is if you look at like the average per carries, it's pretty good. But on a play-to-play basis, they're not having success. So Breece Hall could pop big runs, but there's lots of like 2-yard runs, 1-yard runs. So it's a case that like the Jets are making big plays in the run game, and sometimes that's enough. Right now Breece Hall's averaging 6.6 yards per carry, but there are also a lot of plays where the run blocking is not effective, and it's gotten a little bit better the last couple of weeks. The Jets have reshuffled their offensive line after a rough first 2 weeks, and Dwayne Brown got injured, but the success rate for the Jets on run game is not super high. It's just that they're making big plays. Now, an 80-yard touchdown run, that's obviously a play that could swing a game, but I don't think there's been consistency, even if the averages have been good for the Jets on the ground.
Yeah, and that's kind of been the story for the Denver Broncos as well. You feel like you're getting some big runs from Javonte Williams, Samaje Perine, but the run game hadn't been consistent up until this past weekend against Chicago, where Jaleel McLaughlin, the undrafted rookie free agent out of Youngstown State, came not out of nowhere. He was kind of their preseason superstar, but he came up the ranks of the depth chart, so to speak, with Javonte Williams suffering a bit of a hip injury and ended up he was the team's leader in carries in this game, only 7 carries, but averaged 10 yards per carry and contributed as a receiver. And it wasn't just, like you said, just one big run that contributed to this high average. It was, he's ripping off 9 yards, 13 yards, 12 yards. It seemed like he was really providing them some juice in the running game, which then opened up what is going to be my favorite matchup in this game, the Broncos wide receivers against the Jets defensive backs. Feel like that's arguably strength on strength in many ways. The Denver Broncos wide receivers, not the deepest group in the league. Courtland Sutton may not be the wide receiver one that he looked like back in 2019, but I'll tell you what, this Broncos receiver group came up clutch in week 4 against the Chicago Bears. All of them were making plays. Jerry Jeudy, Courtland Sutton, Marvin Mims, the rookie who's been great out of Oklahoma, even Lil Jordan Humphrey and Brandon Johnson came out and made some big plays. So the receiver position for Denver going up against, Sauce Gardner and that whole Jets secondary, that right there is going to be an individual matchup where every single play is Russell Wilson, first of all, going to have time to get the ball to these guys, but are those receivers going to win their matchups? That's going to be fascinating.
Let me give you one more. New York Jets defensive coaching staff against themselves, because this defensive line, they've had a good game against Kansas City. It was supposed to be the biggest strength of the team. I think it's been a little bit disappointing. The guy they have to get on the field is a defensive end, Bryce Huff, who's in his 4th year. He was an undrafted free agent in 2020 out of Memphis. I think he's the best pass rusher the Jets have right now, and he's seen limited snaps. And I think like the Jets coaching staff is getting a little too focused on draft pedigree, because Jermaine Johnson, who was a first-round pick a year ago, has gotten more snaps than him. I think Jermaine Johnson's doing okay, but Bryce Huff is looking like an impact pass rusher. And in fairness, they increased Huff's snap total a week ago. He's playing more on rundowns. They're trying to get him into the lineup more, but this is the guy who needs to play more for the Jets. And I think they've been keeping him on the bench to their own detriment. So sometimes I think coaching staffs get a little too focused on who was the first round pick versus who was an undrafted free agent at the expense of who's playing well. And Bryce Huff's a guy who is a very disruptive player when he's in there. I think the Jets coaching staff needs to get him more action.
Denver Broncos fans can certainly relate to that. A number of different position groups maybe needing some shuffling or guys getting more playing time. We're going to get into the keys to victory on today's special crossover Thursday edition, Locked On Broncos, Locked On Jets.
Today's crossover episode between the Locked On Broncos podcast, Locked On Jets, is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel Sportsbook, America's #1 sportsbook. Snap into the NFL action this season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. Once again, if you're a new customer, all you have to do is place a $5 bet and you will get $200 back in bonus bets, whether you win or whether you lose. And if you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action than right now with the NFL season in full swing. With NBA season coming up, NHL season coming up. They have sports for everything that you can get in on the action. The app is super easy to use, and there's a wide range of betting options, including spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. Specifically, the Broncos, they're home favorites this week against the Jets. If you believe that they're going to get the victory at home, well, FanDuel is a place where you can get in on the action. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season. FanDuel is the official partner of the NFL. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Do you ever feel like your brain is getting in its own way? Like you know what you should do, what's good for you, but you just can't do it? Therapy helps you figure out what's holding you back so you can work for yourself instead of working against yourself. Now, I've used BetterHelp in the past, and it was very beneficial for me as I was in the process between transitioning between a new career and a new job. And on top of that, having to move and just dealing with the everyday stress that life brings. Sometimes I worked, and I never balanced that process there, and I had a hard time doing that. Therapy helped me figure out a way to kind of bridge those things together so I could find more balance in my life. And I love the fact that all I did was fill out a questionnaire. It matched me to a therapist. And luckily, my therapist and I, we hit it off really well. But if you don't vibe well with your therapist that you get matched to when you sign up at BetterHelp, you can change therapists at any time at no additional cost to yourself there. And if you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and best of all, suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and get matched to a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Make your brain your friend with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Once again, BetterHelp.com/lockedon.
What do these two teams, the Denver Broncos and the New York Jets, have to do in order to get a victory, a much-needed, must-win game for both of these teams on Sunday? John, I'm going to pitch it to you first. What do you feel like the Jets need to do? If they do nothing else, what do they have to do in order to go into the Mile High City and get a victory on Sunday?
So what I'm saying is probably going to sound a bit counterintuitive because you've talked about the Broncos' struggles against the run. I think the Jets need to avoid the temptation of going back to their playbook, weeks 1 through 3 and constantly running the ball on early downs, because even if you're a bad run defense, if the play calling is predictable on the other side, you can load the box, you can take away the run. You can put 8-9 guys in the box and make it more difficult, even for a great back like Breece Hall. I think the Jets need to stay aggressive. Like, I think that, there's a real temptation there when you look at the way the Broncos have struggled on the ground against the run to say, oh, we'll get back to the old playbook. But if you look at this Jets offense, it's had success when they've thrown on early down, or at least had balance. Maybe not, they did not throw to an extreme extent on Sunday night against the Chiefs. They had balance, though. They kind of kept the Chiefs off balance on defense. So I think that for me, that's the number one key for the Jets. And also, look, the Jets need to execute. Throwing on early downs does not necessarily mean you're going to move the ball. Zach Wilson needs to continue to make decisive reads. There's an amazing split with him. When you look at his numbers, when he releases the ball in less than 2.5 seconds versus after 2.5 seconds, it's unbelievable what the splits are. He's very, very effective this year throwing the ball when he gets it out quickly. When he holds the ball for more than 2.5 seconds, he's at the bottom of the league. And part of this is, there are times where he's decisive, and when he has success. There are times where he's not and he doesn't have success. Part of this is also incumbent upon Garrett Wilson, because I think right now Zach Wilson's about a guy who's maybe a 1.5 to 2 read quarterback, whereas a year ago I think he was a 1 to 1.5 read quarterback. So that means his initial target's got to get open. That's Garrett Wilson. That goes back to that matchup I talked about, Wilson versus Surtain.
Yeah, and I think from the Broncos side of things, it's really kind of the opposite end. It's forcing incompletions, making sure that you get off the field in third down situations. I talked about how important stopping the run is, but look, over the last 2 weeks, the Denver Broncos have allowed Justin Fields and Tua Tagovailoa only 10 incomplete passes in each of those 2 games. One of them was a Hail Mary at the end of the first half from Justin Fields against the Chicago Bears. So we're talking about legitimately 9 incomplete passes over a 2-game span for 2 starting quarterbacks, one of which set a career franchise record of 335 passing yards, the most that he's ever thrown for in Justin Fields. The Broncos are not forcing incompletions right now as a secondary. And part of that is the pass rush has been inconsistent, but a lot of it is the fact that these defensive backs are just not making plays on the ball. Now, we'll see, as we know, Sean Payton is very coy about injuries and updates and things like that. We don't necessarily know at the time that we're recording this whether K'Wan Williams, the guy who's supposed to be starting in the nickel, is going to play for the Broncos. We don't know if Justin Simmons, who's been out the last 2 weeks, is going to play. that kind of stuff he keeps close to the vest. But Damari Mathis, the number 2 corner this year for the Denver Broncos, who was, really standout as a rookie, very, very good rookie season. He has been horrendous so far in 2023. Quarterbacks throwing into his coverage. The quarterback rating, if you throw at Damari Mathis, 149.4 this season. So it's teams finding ways to match up their best guys. And I assume we will see Garrett Wilson find ways to get matched up against Damari Mathis and not Pat Surtain. And the Jets are going to try to exploit that because Damari has had a very, very rough season, but the Denver Broncos could help him out a lot if they're able to get guys like Justin Simmons, K'Wan Williams back. If not, we're going to have to see guys like Delarian Turner-Yell, Kareem Jackson continue to step up, Jaquan McMillan, who played in place of Hussein Bassi in the nickel last week. But I think the Broncos, ultimately, you got to find a way to force some incompletions and not let Zach Wilson get, because I watched that Chiefs game, John. I'm rooting for the Jets. And when they're playing the Chiefs, I'm rooting for the Jets. But I you watch that offense move the ball when they're down big early. You got to like what you're seeing from Zach Wilson. So from the Broncos perspective, you can't let him stay hot. You've got to make sure that you start forcing incompletions, force him to get into his head, and the pass rush has got to get home. So ultimately, how do you see this game shaking out? What's your thoughts? What's your predictions for the game? If you have any, what do you see happening on Sunday afternoon?
This game worries me, and maybe that's just because I've been a Jets fan for too long, but it feels like this is the kind of game the Jets always lose, where, you have these good feelings. You say, okay, this matchup looks favorable on paper. Like, I always say this whenever we do these crossover shows. I don't care how bad the Broncos are. I hate going to Denver. I think that's a really tough road venue to play at. I think it's going to be a close game. I worry about Hackett maybe regressing a little bit. I worry about Hackett maybe taking the bait and being too conservative on offense. I do think the Jets have enough firepower on offense to win this game. I think that another thing we haven't talked about, the Jets through the first 4 weeks have had arguably the best special teams unit in the NFL, and that can make a big difference in a game that you're expecting to be close. So I think the Jets maybe eke out a win, maybe something like 20-17. I think this game is closer than I would feel comfortable with. I don't feel as good about it as a couple of weeks ago when I was watching the Broncos play those first couple of weeks. I felt really good about this game from a Jets standpoint. I don't feel as good about it. Part of it's the way the Broncos fought back last week. Part of it's I'm not sure I trust the Jets as much as I did a couple of weeks ago. I think the Jets sneak out a win, but I wouldn't be surprised either way.
Right. Same here. And that's just kind of the state of these two franchises right now, the way things are. It's too tough to definitively say, even playing at home, to definitively say, oh yeah, they got this one. They're playing at home. This isn't the Peyton Manning Denver Broncos anymore. I said this against, the Dolphins. I said this against the Bears. I feel like in those two games, I was like first to 30 wins. In this game against the Jets, I'll say first to 23 wins. And if you can get to 23 points in this game, I think you've got a good chance of winning, because I don't know that the Denver Broncos can. I'm not 100% sold that they can score more than 23 against the Robert Saleh defense. I'm not 100% sold on that. But also, I feel like if the Jets get over 23, that means that the Broncos defense is obviously giving up a lot in this game. So I could definitely see it, like you said, being a bit of a low scoring game here. Certainly from the Denver Broncos perspective and from the New York Jets perspective, this is a must-win game. And we're excited to see what happens. We're excited to see how Nathaniel Hackett does respond to going back to Denver. And I'm sure he'll hear it from the fan base there. And what do the Broncos do building off that game against the Chicago Bears? Can they keep that going? Can they keep the confidence flowing and get what Sean Payton has said? This team needs to learn not to lose, right? It's not just a matter of learning how to win, but you got to learn how to not lose first. A lot of the culture in Denver still has yet to be changed, even with Nathaniel Hackett now out east with the New York Jets. But John, thanks so much for being part of this today. Thanks so much for your insights on the New York Jets. And we can't say thank you enough to all of you that listen to Locked On Broncos, Locked On Jets, that you make it your first listen of the day every single day right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'll see you Sunday.